In 1997, a boy in an orange parka was killed by an alien probe in the first episode of a new animated series on Comedy Central. He came back the following week. Nobody mentioned it. That same boy was killed approximately 100 more times across the next 27 years. Space Station, by Ozzy Osbourne, by a stray bullet that traveled across an entire town to find him eating dinner, and by a time travel experiment set 40 years in the future. In the 1999 film, he went to hell, counseled Satan through an abusive relationship, sacrificed himself so the world could survive, and was finally allowed into heaven. In season 14, he revealed he remembers every single death while nobody around him remembers any of them. The show treated all of this as a running joke for 5 seasons, and then quietly turned it into something else entirely. Welcome to East Park, let's get into it. The boy who died before the show even started there is a version of this story that begins in 1997, when South Park first aired on Comedy Central and a small boy in an orange parka was killed by an alien probe in the very first episode. That version is accurate, but it is incomplete. The real beginning is earlier than that, and it is stranger, and it tells you something important about why Kenny McCormick exists at all, and why dying was always going to be central to who he was. Go back to 1992. Trey Parker and Matt Stone are students at the University of Colorado. They are young, they do not have much money, and they make a short animated film using construction paper cutouts and stop motion. The film is called Jesus vs. Frosty, and it features 4 children who look, in a rough early way, like the 4 boys who would eventually become the main cast of South Park. One of those children wears something resembling an orange hood. He does not have a name yet. He is not called Kenny. In fact, in this first short, the character who gets called Kenny by the other children is the round one, the one who would later become Cartman. The unnamed hooded figure speaks clearly in this short, his mouth visible, his voice unmuffled. He says one line, and then both he and the Cartman-like character die before the short is over. That is the first death, years before the show, years before anyone knew there would be a show. A boy in orange unnamed dying in a handmade animation that almost nobody saw. 3 years pass. In 1995, Parker and Stone are approached by a television executive named Brian Graydon. Graydon asks them to make another short, something he can use as a video Christmas card to send to friends in the industry. Parker and Stone go back to the same 4 characters, the same construction paper world, but this time they refine everything. The hooded character gets a name. He becomes Kenny. He keeps the orange parka. His mouth is now hidden inside the hood, which muffles everything he says. And in this second short, called Jesus vs. Santa, Kenny dies again. This time, it is more deliberate. This time, the death feels like a choice rather than a consequence of the plot. Graydon sends the tape to his friends. His friends copy it and send it to their friends. The short spreads, slowly and quietly, through the television industry and then beyond it, moving from hand to hand in an era before the internet made that kind of spreading easy. By the time Parker and Stone are offered a deal to develop a full series, a version of Kenny has already died twice, and a version of his death is already part of what people respond to. This matters because it means the death gag was never invented for the show. It arrived with the character. It was not a writer's room decision made halfway through season 1 to add something unexpected. It was there from the very beginning, built into the DNA of who Kenny was, before he had a last name, before he had a family, before he had a house or a sister or a pair of parents who drank too much and fought too loudly. Death was the first thing Kenny ever did on screen, and it remained the most defining thing he ever did for the first 5 years of the show's run. Now here is the detail that makes Kenny even stranger. In a 2000 interview, Trey Parker explained where Kenny actually came from. He had a childhood friend, a real person, also named Kenny, who grew up in a poor family and wore an orange parka. The hood muffled his voice. The other kids had trouble understanding what he was saying. He was the poorest child in the neighborhood. He missed school often. When he was absent, the other kids, being kids, would say things like he must have died, and then he would come back. Parker and his friends would joke about it, shrug, move on. The real Kenny kept returning from wherever he had been, and nobody made a very big deal of it. That is the original joke. A real boy, a real parka, real poverty, real absences, real returns. Parker took that memory and built a cartoon character around it, and in doing so, he made a choice, probably without fully thinking through what it would mean, to plant death at the center of a child's identity. The fictional Kenny would die. He would always come back. Nobody would remember. This was funny because it echoed something real. The way certain kinds of poverty make people invisible, make their suffering easy to forget, make their presence and absence feel equally unremarkable to the people around them. That reading of Kenny as a symbol of economic invisibility is one the show earned slowly and probably did not plan from the start, but it was always possible because of where the character came from. A real kid, orange parka, too poor for anyone to pay close attention, disappeared sometime. Nobody made a big deal of it. When South Park premiered on August 13, 1997, Kenny appeared in the very first episode alongside alongside Stan, Kyle, and Cartman at the bus stop. The episode is called Cartman Gets an Anal Probe, and before it is over, Kenny is killed. He is hit by a cattle prod, picked up by a UFO, and incinerated. Stan and Kyle deliver the line, "Kenny is gone." And then the next episode begins, and he is standing at the bus stop again, parka on, voice muffled, as though nothing happened. The show does not explain this. No one comments on it. It just continues. For audiences in 1997, that was genuinely disorienting. Cartoons killed characters sometimes, but they came back because cartoons did not take death seriously. South Park seemed to be doing something different. It was presenting the death with just enough realism, enough weight in Stan and Kyle's reaction, enough specificity in how Kenny died to make it feel real, and then immediately treating it as though it had not happened. The joke was not just that a child died. The joke was that it did not matter, that no one held it, that the world continued without even a pause. That rhythm, death, response, forgetting, return, would repeat itself dozens of times across the first 5 seasons. Each time the show found a new way for Kenny to die. Each time the reaction was brief. Each time the next episode began as though the slate was clean. The gag worked because of the contrast between the specificity of the deaths, which were often genuinely gruesome, and the total absence of consequence that followed them. Kenny's death was both the most dramatic thing that happened in a given episode and the least important. What Parker and Stone understood, either instinctively or consciously, was that comedy lives in that gap. The gap between what something looks like it should mean and what it actually means to the people in the room. Kenny's deaths looked like they should be devastating. They were treated as minor inconveniences or as nothing at all. That tension was the engine of the gag, and it ran for 5 full seasons before the creators grew tired of feeding it. But before any of that exhaustion set in, before the writers ran low on original methods, and before the joke began to feel like an obligation rather than a choice, there was a stretch of early South Park where killing Kenny was genuinely inventive, where each new death was a small creative puzzle, where the show was asking itself, what has not been done yet, and how badly can we do it? The answer across season 1 alone was varied and relentless. Kenny was killed by Death himself in the episode simply titled Death. He was killed by a falling satellite. He was killed by a flu that wiped out the town. He died in a kindergarten flashback during the episode Summer Sucks, meaning the show established that he had been dying since before the timeline the audience was watching. He had been dying in some form since he was small enough to hold a firecracker in one hand. That kindergarten death is worth pausing on because it does something subtle and strange. It retroactively extends the gag backward. It suggests that Kenny's deaths were not something that started when the show started. They were already happening in the past, in the history of this character that the audience is only now meeting. He arrived on screen with a body of deaths already behind him. He was not new to this. The universe had been killing him for years before anyone was watching. That detail, dropped casually in a season 1 episode, turned out to be more meaningful than it probably seemed at the time. It implied something about Kenny's relationship with death that the show would not fully address until many seasons later. Not that he was unlucky, not that the writers liked killing him, but that Death and Kenny had some kind of arrangement, some ongoing relationship that preceded the show and might outlast it. The real boy in the orange parka skipped school sometime. The fictional boy in the orange parka died sometime, and in both cases the world around him kept moving. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Section 1 took us back to where Kenny actually began. A construction paper short, a real childhood friend, and a gag that arrived fully formed before the show even had a name. In Section 2, we move into the golden era, the years when the writers were at their most creative, and Kenny's deaths were at their most elaborate, their most gruesome, and their most strangely funny. Section 2, Seasons 1 through 3, the golden era of dying. There is a particular kind of television that only exists in its earliest years. Before the writers know exactly what they have, before the audience has settled into expectation, before the show itself has figured out its own rules. South Park in its first 3 seasons had that quality, raw and fast and slightly reckless, still discovering what it could get away with, still finding out which jokes landed and which ones the network would call about. Kenny's deaths in those years had that same energy. They were not refined, they were not always elegant, but they were inventive in a way that became harder to sustain as the seasons accumulated and the gag became an institution rather than a surprise. To understand what made the golden era of Kenny's deaths work, it helps to understand the creative problem Parker and Stone had set themselves. They had committed, either consciously or by accident of the first few episodes, to killing Kenny in almost every installment of the show. That meant they needed a new cause of death every single week. Not just a new method, but a new context, a new setup, a new way of arriving at the moment so that it did not feel like repetition even though it was, by definition, the same event happening again and again. The challenge was to make identical outcomes outcomes feel different each time, to make the audience laugh at something they had already seen dozens of times by presenting it from an angle they had not seen before. This is a genuinely difficult creative problem. Most shows that attempt a recurring gag of this kind run out of steam quickly. The joke becomes a tick, the audience stops engaging with it, and simply waits for it to happen. Parker and Stone avoided that fate for 3 full seasons, and the way they avoided it is worth examining closely, because it tells you something about how comedy actually works when it is done with craft rather than just repetition. The first tool they used was scale. Kenny's deaths in the early seasons ranged from the completely mundane to the cosmically absurd, and the show moved between those registers without warning. One episode, Kenny would be killed by something as small as an antacid tablet dissolving in his stomach after he drank a glass of water. Another episode, a chunk of a Russian space station would fall from orbit and land directly on him. The scale was never predictable. You could not tell from the setup of the episode whether Kenny was going to die from something microscopic or something planetary. That unpredictability kept the audience engaged even when the outcome was guaranteed. The antacid death deserves a moment of attention on its own, because it is an early example of the show understanding that the build-up matters as much as the death itself. The episode from season 1 involves Chef trying to recover song royalties that have been stolen from him. The A-plot has nothing to do with Kenny, but somewhere in the middle of it, Kenny eats what he believes are harmless candies. Chef reveals too late that the bowl contained antacid tablets. Kenny has already started drinking a large glass of water. The camera cuts to Kenny filling slowly with foam, expanding the pressure building, and then he explodes. The death takes about 30 seconds of screen time and has essentially nothing to do with the rest of the episode. It arrives, it happens, and the episode continues without comment. That structural choice, the death as an interruption rather than a climax, was one of the show's early signatures. Kenny did not die at the end of the episode as a button. He did not die at the beginning as a cold open shock. He died in the middle, at whatever moment the writers decided worked, and the story simply absorbed the interruption and kept moving. This made the deaths feel both inevitable and genuinely surprising. You were always waiting for them, and they always arrived at the wrong moment. They never came when you expected them to, which meant you were never fully prepared, even though you knew it was coming. The space station death from the Halloween episode Pink Eye in season 1 operates on the opposite principle. This time the death does come early, within the first few minutes. The episode opens with a sequence set on a Russian space station. The station is clearly falling out of orbit. The scene is long enough for the audience to understand exactly what is about to happen. Then the show cuts to the 4 boys at the bus stop, standing in a line, and a piece of the falling station lands directly on Kenny. It is an enormous crushing impact, and it kills him instantly. Stan and Kyle deliver their line. The episode continues. But then Kenny dies again before the episode is over, which made Pink Eye one of the first episodes to establish that dying him once was not necessarily the limit. Kenny could, in the right circumstances, manage 2 deaths in a single installment. That detail, Kenny dying more than once in an episode, became another tool in the writer's kit. It was used sparingly enough to feel like an event when it happened. Most episodes had a single Kenny death. The ones that had 2 created a small additional jolt, a sense that the universe was being particularly aggressive on this particular day, that whatever force was responsible for Kenny's misfortunes had decided to work overtime. The question of what force was responsible was something the show raised and then largely left alone for years. In the season 1 episode simply titled Death, the answer was almost literally given to the audience. Death himself appears in South Park, a robed figure moving through the town in search of someone to take. The episode's A-plot involves Grandpa Marsh trying to convince Stan to help him die because he is 102 years old and exhausted. Death arrived, and the joke is that Grandpa is the obvious target, the one who wants to go. Death touches Kenny instead. This is the only South Park episode where the entity literally responsible for ending lives makes an appearance and chooses Kenny specifically, personally, out of everyone available. No explanation is given. No reason is offered. Death just touches him, and he dies, and the episode moves on. That moment is strange when you look at it carefully. It is played for comedy, and it works as comedy, but underneath the joke is a genuinely disturbing implication. Death, presented here as a conscious entity with agency and preference, passes over the elderly man who is asking to die, and selects instead an 8-year-old child in an orange parka. The choice feels arbitrary. It is arbitrary. But arbitrariness, when applied consistently to one specific person over years and years, starts to look less like randomness and more like targeting. Like something has decided that Kenny specifically is the one who died, not anyone else. Not randomly distributed across the population, Kenny. The show would return to that implication much later. In this first season, it was just a joke. A very good joke executed well, but a joke. The deeper reading was available but not required. Moving into season 2, the deaths became more elaborate. The writers were growing more confident, and they had a better sense of what the audience would accept. The season 2 episode Chef Aid introduced what many fans consider one of the finest Kenny deaths in the show's entire run. Chef is trying to recover money owed to him from a music contract, and the episode becomes a massive charity concert featuring real musicians, with Ozzy Osbourne as one of the performers. Ozzy has a reputation for biting the heads off small animals on stage. At Chef Aid, in front of a screaming crowd, he bites off Kenny's heads instead. The crowd goes absolutely wild. Ozzy holds the severed head aloft. Blood sprays in all directions. Stan and Kyle deliver the line without much enthusiasm. The concert continues. What makes this death notable is not just the method, though the method is genuinely creative. It is the audience reaction. The crowd cheers. They are thrilled. They came for a rock concert and got a child decapitation, and they are responding as though this is exactly what they hoped for. The death is absorbed not just by the main characters, as usual, but by an entire fictional audience of adults who witness it and find it entertaining. The show is making a joke about its own audience, and about what audiences will accept when it is dressed up in the right context. Put a rock star on a stage and have him do something monstrous, and people will cheer for it. The joke has a small edge to it, a mild accusation, and it lands because the show earned it through the commitment of the performance. Season 2 also gave audiences one of the more structurally interesting Kenny deaths. In the episode, Cartman gets an anal probe. Actually, no, that was season 1. The relevant season 2 death that deserves attention here comes from the episode Chickenpox, in which Kenny is sent to stay with his family after the boys are deliberately given chickenpox by their parents. The death in this episode is quiet compared to most. Kenny contracts something during the episode, though not chickenpox exactly, and dies in his home in the environment of his poverty. This is one of the early deaths that connects Kenny's mortality to his economic situation in a way that feels less like comedy and more like the show acknowledging something uncomfortable. He dies at home, in a small house, surrounded by the conditions his family lives in. The death does not involve a monster or a machine or a celebrity musician. It is closer to the deaths that real poor children sometimes face, and the show treats it with the same casual shrug it treats every other Kenny death, which in this context makes the shrug feel slightly darker than usual. By season 3, Parker and Stone had established enough of a pattern that they could start playing with the audience's expectations in more sophisticated ways. The episode Spontaneous Combustion, in which the residents of South Park begin randomly exploding due to a scientific phenomenon, kills Kenny via the episode's central premise in a way that is both expected and slightly anticlimactic. The death comes from the show's own A-plot, which was rare. Usually Kenny's deaths were tangential to whatever the main story was doing. In Spontaneous Combustion, he is killed by the very thing the episode is about, which makes his death feel, for once, like it belongs in the narrative, rather than interrupting it. Also in season 3 came the death by monkey assault in the episode Hooked on Monkey Phonics, and the death during a sled run in which bricks fall from above and crush him. Each of these is memorable for different reasons. The monkey assault is absurd in a specifically chaotic way that feels characteristic of season 3's slightly wilder energy. The brick death is memorable because of the setting, a cheerful winter activity, children sledding, and then bricks from nowhere landing on one specific child. The contrast between the festive context and the sudden violence was a formula the show returned to repeatedly because it worked reliably. What season 3 also began to suggest quietly and without announcement was that the gag had a ceiling. The deaths were still good, the audience was still responding, but the writers were beginning to reach for methods that were slightly more forced, slightly more reliant on the absurdity of the premise rather than the cleverness of the execution. This is not a criticism. Running out of genuinely fresh ideas for killing a child every week for 3 years is not a creative failure. It is an inevitability. The question was what to do about it. Parker and Stone did not solve that problem in season 3. They kept going, kept finding new methods, kept delivering the gag with enough commitment that the audience stayed engaged. But the seeds of the season 5 decision, the decision to stop, to kill Kenny for real, to end the gag before it killed itself, were planted in these later golden era episodes. You can feel it watching them now. The deaths are still good, but there is something slightly mechanical about the best of them, a sense that the writers are executing rather than discovering. The spontaneity that made the season 1 and early season 2 deaths feel genuinely alive was becoming harder to sustain. None of this was visible to audiences at the time. The show was still enormously popular. Kenny's deaths were still generating reactions. The phrase, the line that Stan and Kyle delivered after each death, had become one of the most quoted pieces of dialogue in American television. People said it to each other in school hallways and office break rooms. It appeared on t-shirts. It was referenced in other television shows. The gag had achieved a kind of cultural mass that went far beyond South Park itself, and all of that cultural mass was built on a simple repeating event. A small boy in an orange parka died, and the world around him shrugged, and he came back. By the end of season 3, Kenny had died approximately 70 times. The methods had included fire, explosions, animals, falling objects, disease, dismemberment, alien abduction, a direct visit from Death himself, and Ozzy Osbourne's teeth. He had died at school, at home, at a concert, in the woods, in space, in a flashback, and during a winter activity involving sleds and bricks. He had been crushed, bitten, exploded, incinerated, and absorbed by a giant firework snake made of ash. Each time Stan said, "Oh my god, they killed Kenny." Each time Kyle said, "You bastards." Each time Kenny came back. The universe kept doing it, and Kenny kept surviving it, and the audience kept watching. That was the arrangement. It seemed for a long time like it could last forever. It could not. But before it ended, there were still things the show had not done with Kenny's death. There were still ways it had not yet used him. And one of those ways involved something the gag had carefully avoided for 3 full seasons: genuine feeling. The show had never let Kenny's deaths mean something. It had always absorbed them, neutralized them, moved past them. But there were moments coming in the film, in the later seasons, where the show would test what happened when it stopped shrugging, when it let the death breathe, when it let the audience feel it. That test would change everything about how Kenny worked as a character, and it would set in motion the decisions that led to the most unusual creative choice the show ever made: the decision to stop killing him. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The golden era of Kenny's deaths ran on creativity and speed and a willingness to be gruesome without apology. But as season 3 closed, something was shifting. The gag was becoming routine, and the show was beginning to feel the weight of its own commitment. Section 3 moves into the deaths that stopped being just funny, the ones that made people feel something they were not expecting to feel, and what that shift revealed about who Kenny actually was beneath the parka. Section 3, the deaths that made people uncomfortable. There is a moment in almost every long-running comedy where the joke trips over something real, where the setup is the same as always, where the punchline arrives on schedule, but somewhere between the two, something catches. Something that was always underneath the surface of the joke breaks through briefly, and the audience laughs and then goes quiet. Not because the joke failed, but because it succeeded in a way they were not prepared for. South Park hit that moment with Kenny's death several times across the middle portion of the show's run, and each time it happened, it revealed something about the character that the relentless pace of the golden era had kept buried. To be clear about what this section is and is not, this is not a claim that South Park suddenly became a serious drama, or that the show abandoned its commitment to offensive, irreverent, deliberately tasteless comedy in order to make some kind of point about child mortality. South Park never stopped being South Park. The humor was always present. The absurdity was always present. But certain episodes, certain specific moments involving Kenny's death introduced a layer of emotional weight that sat underneath the joke rather than replacing it. And that combination, comedy and genuine feeling occupying the same frame simultaneously, was more unsettling than either one would have been alone. The first place to look for this shift is not in the television series itself, but in the 1999 feature film. South Park, bigger, longer, and uncut, arrived 2 years into the show's run, when the series was at peak cultural saturation. Everyone knew about South Park by 1999. Everyone knew Kenny died. The film was expected to be more of what the show already was, pushed further, more vulgar, more offensive, bigger in scale, and it was all of those things. But what nobody quite anticipated was what the film would do with Kenny, which was take the death gag and stretch it across an entire feature-length story in a way that gave it genuine narrative weight for the first time. Kenny dies in the film early. The setup is characteristic of the show at its most committed to absurdity. Kenny makes a bet with Cartman that he can set his flatulence on fire, imitating something he saw in the Terrence and Phillip film that the boys snuck into at the beginning of the movie. He lights it. He is immediately engulfed in flame. He is rushed to a hospital where a doctor voiced by George Clooney accidentally replaces Kenny's heart with a baked potato during surgery, and Kenny dies on the operating table. This is on the surface exactly the kind of death the golden era television episodes were built around. Escalating absurdity, a cause of death that makes no real sense, a moment of catastrophic medical incompetence played for dark comedy. The execution is confident and funny, and the audience laughs. And then something different happens. Kenny's soul rises out of his body. The camera follows it upward, and Kenny goes to heaven. The show had implied Kenny went somewhere after his deaths before, but it had never actually shown it. The film commits to the bit in a way the show had carefully avoided, and what it shows is specific and strange and tonally unlike anything the gag had produced before. Heaven in the South Park film is populated almost entirely by Mormons, because the logic of the film's universe is that only Mormons qualify for entry. Kenny arrives at the gates and is turned away. way. He descends instead to hell, which is where he finds Satan in an abusive relationship with Saddam Hussein, and where the real plot of the film begins to take shape. What Kenny does in hell for the rest of the film is genuinely interesting in the context of his character. He is not a victim in hell. He is not suffering. He is observant, and then he is useful. He notices that Satan is in a bad relationship, that Saddam is manipulative and cruel, and is using Satan's insecurity to maintain control over him. Kenny, a child from a poor family who has spent his entire existence dying and being forgotten, becomes a source of emotional clarity for the literal ruler of the underworld. He encourages Satan to recognize his own worth. He helps move the plot toward its resolution. And when the resolution comes, when Satan has thrown Saddam back into hell and the war that threatened to destroy the world has been averted, Satan offers Kenny a wish. One wish for anything. Kenny wishes for everything to go back to the way it was before the war. He wishes for the casualties to be undone, for the fighting to stop, for the world to return to normal. He understands as he makes this wish that doing so means he will remain in hell. He will not return to his life. He will not come back. He is making a deliberate sacrifice, choosing to stay dead so that everyone else can continue living. For his sacrifice, he is finally allowed entry into heaven. This is a completely different kind of key death than anything the television series had produced. It is not a Kenny death at all in the traditional sense. The gag version of Kenny's death is accidental, meaningless, absorbed without comment. The film's version of Kenny's death is a chosen sacrifice made with full knowledge of the consequences by a character who has spent the entire story doing something genuinely good. The film treats the death as an act of heroism and then rewards it with the one thing the gag had always denied Kenny: recognition. He is acknowledged. His choice matters. The world is better because of what he did. The audience in 1999 laughed through most of the film, as they were supposed to. But the ending, Kenny's final moment of sacrifice, and then his ascension into a heaven he had been turned away from at the beginning, landed differently than a standard Kenny death. There was something affecting about it that the television episodes had never quite achieved, because the television episode had been specifically constructed to prevent affecting the film with more time and a narrative arc that actually belonged to Kenny rather than treating him as a recurring interruption, had done something the gag format could not. It had made his death mean something. That shift in meaning was not forgotten when the show returned to the television format. The audience had now seen a version of Kenny that was more than a prop. They had seen him think, choose, sacrifice, and be rewarded. Going back to the episodic death gag after that was possible, and the show did it, but the texture of Kenny's deaths had changed slightly. The gag was the same, but there was now something underneath it that had not been there before. The television series began to probe that something in the episodes that followed, not consistently, not even frequently, but in specific moments scattered across seasons 4 and 5 that suggested the writers were aware of what the film had unlocked. One of those moments comes in the season 4 episode, Cartman Joins Nambla, in which Kenny is killed multiple times in the same episode through a genuinely elaborate series of accidents, each one more catastrophic than the last. The deaths in this episode are played for maximum comedy, and they are very funny. But there is also something slightly exhausting about them, in a way that feels deliberate. The episode stacks Kenny's deaths so relentlessly, one immediately following another, that the gag tips slightly into something that resembles cruelty. Not cruelty toward the audience, but cruelty toward Kenny. The episode is almost mean to him, in a way that invites the audience to notice the meanness, even while laughing at it. That noticing is important. It is the show beginning to let the audience feel the weight of what Kenny endures, even while continuing to play that weight for laughs. The comedy and the discomfort are both present, and the show is not resolving the tension between them. It is sitting in the tension and seeing what happens. The most significant moment of genuine discomfort before the formal ending of the gag in season 5 comes from an episode in season 4 called Cherokee Hair Tampon. The plot of the episode involves Kyle developing a serious kidney condition that may kill him. Stan is terrified that his best friend might die. He tells Kenny repeatedly how worried he is, how scared he is of losing Kyle, and Kenny, who listens to all of this, becomes visibly irritated. He responds, his voice muffled as always, with lines that the show translates through context rather than clarity. He is essentially saying, "You never care when I die. Kyle might die and you are devastated. I have died dozens of times and you have never reacted like this. What is the difference?" There is no good answer to that question, and the show knows it. Kyle does not have a good answer. Stan does not have a good answer. The episode moves on. Kenny's frustration is played for a quick laugh and then it is gone, and the episode continues. But the question hangs in the air long after the episode ends. What is the difference? Why does Kyle's potential death produce genuine grief from the people who love him, while Kenny's actual deaths produce nothing more than a brief, almost bored recitation of a familiar line? The obvious answer is that Kyle is a character with full interiority, a voice, voice, a perspective, a role in the narrative that makes his absence feel like a real loss. Kenny, by design, is muffled and peripheral, and dies so often that his death has been stripped of meaning through repetition. But that obvious answer is also, when you look at it honestly, a story about what happens when a person's suffering is so constant and so familiar that the people around them stop registering it. That is not funny, that is something else. And the show, by letting Kenny articulate the unfairness even briefly, was acknowledging that the something else was real. The death in the season 4 episode, The Tooth Fairy Tats 2000, is worth mentioning here because it demonstrates the show doing something technically interesting with the gag around this time. In this episode, Kenny is killed by a stray bullet that travels a remarkable distance and passes through the window of the McCormick house and hits Kenny in the head while he is sitting at the dinner table. The death is presented almost in slow motion relative to the show's usual pace, with the camera following the path of the bullet through the window and across the room. The setup is elaborate and deliberate. The show is spending more time than usual on the architecture of the death, which has the effect of making the audience notice the architecture, which in turn makes the death feel slightly more considered, slightly less throwaway. The extra attention is the show signaling, quietly, that it is aware this gag has layers it has not fully explored. Season 4 also contained, toward the end of its run, something that the show had done occasionally before, but would do with more frequency as it approached the formal ending of the death gag. It let Kenny know things were coming. The episode, It's Christmas in Canada, which is technically a season 7 episode, contains one of the most direct expressions of Kenny's awareness of his own situation. When the boys prepare to board a plane, Kenny refuses. Stan asks him why. Kenny's muffled response is translated clearly by the show's context. He says he will die if he gets on that plane. Kyle tells him not to be stupid, that he is not going to die. Kenny does not get on the plane, and he survives the episode. He has learned, through the accumulated experience of dying constantly, to anticipate and sometimes avoid his own death. He has developed a kind of expertise that no other character has, because no other character has needed it. That expertise is quietly devastating when you think about it. Kenny has died so many times that he has become skilled at recognizing situations that will kill him. He carries that knowledge alone, because no one else remembers his previous deaths. He is the only expert on his own mortality, and there is no one he can share that expertise with, because the moment he dies and comes back, everyone starts fresh and his experience becomes invisible again. The discomfort that runs through all of these moments, the film's sacrifice, the Cherokee hair tampon's frustration, the elaborate bullet death, the refusal to board the plane, is not the same as the discomfort of a death that is simply too graphic or too cruel. It is a more specific kind of unease. It is the discomfort of watching someone experience something genuinely terrible and recognizing that the people around them are unable or unwilling to register it as terrible. It is the discomfort of invisibility, of suffering that does not count, of pain that the world has decided does not require a response. South Park never said any of that directly. The show does not work that way, but it put the pieces in the frame and let them sit there. And the audience, if they were watching carefully, could feel the shape of what was being left unsaid. The deaths that made people uncomfortable were not the ones where Kenny was dismembered or exploded or had his head bitten off by Ozzy Osbourne. Those were funny. Those were the show at play. The deaths that made people uncomfortable were the ones where the show paused, just briefly, and let the audience see Kenny as someone who was experiencing something rather than just someone to whom something was happening. Those moments were rare, but they accumulated. And by the time season 5 arrived and Parker and Stone made the decision they had been building toward, the audience was ready to feel something about Kenny's death in a way they had not been prepared to feel in season 1. Not because they had not always cared about Kenny in the vague, affectionate way that audiences care about recurring characters, but because the show had slowly, carefully, inconsistently, but persistently given them reasons to care about him specifically, about what he experienced, about what it was like to be him, and then it gave him muscular dystrophy, and a hospital room, and a real goodbye. And for once, nobody shrugged. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Section 3 traced the moments when Kenny's deaths stopped being purely comedic and started carrying something heavier underneath them, from the film's sacrifice to the quiet frustration of a boy who dies constantly while nobody notices. Section 4 moves into the decision that changed everything, why Parker and Stone decided to end the gag, how they almost killed Kyle instead, and what the episode Kenny Dies revealed about how much the audience had grown to feel for a character who could barely speak. Section 4, the season 5 decision and the episode that changed everything. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from doing the same creative thing too many times. Not boredom exactly, and not a loss of skill, more like a sense of diminishing returns, a feeling that the effort being put into something is no longer producing the result it once did, that the gap between what you are putting in and what is coming out has grown too wide to ignore. Trey Parker and Matt Stone reached that point with Kenny's death gag sometime during the production of season 5, and the decision they made in response to it was one of the most unusual creative choices in the history of American animated television. They decided to actually kill him, not in the weekly way, not in the gag way, where the death happens on a Tuesday, and by the following week everyone has forgotten and the slate is clean. They decided to kill Kenny in a way that would stick, in a way that would last, in a way that would require the show to continue without him for an extended period and figure out what it looked like without the recurring death that had been one of its defining features since the very first episode. They decided, in other words, to test what South Park was, without the thing South Park was most famous for. The decision did not arrive cleanly or all at once. It grew out of a combination of factors that Parker and Stone discussed in interviews and DVD commentaries over the years. And those discussions are worth spending time with because they reveal something about how creative decisions actually get made in television, which is rarely through grand strategic thinking and more often through a mixture of exhaustion, practicality, and a willingness to try something that might not work. The first factor was the most straightforward. They were running out of ideas. After nearly 100 Kenny deaths across 5 seasons and a feature film, the challenge of finding a genuinely fresh cause of death every week had become genuinely difficult. The early seasons had been able to draw on an almost unlimited range of methods because everything was new. A child being killed by an antacid tablet was surprising in season 1 because the show had not yet established a vocabulary for how outrageous its deaths could be. By season 5, that vocabulary was fully established and the audience's threshold for surprise had risen considerably. What had once been shocking was now expected, and what had once been expected was now almost routine. Parker and Stone were not making worse deaths. They were making deaths that had less room to land because the surrounding context had changed. The second factor was more interesting and less often discussed. Kenny by design could barely speak. His voice was muffled inside his parka hood, his dialogue incomprehensible to the audience, his participation in conversations limited to reactions that the other characters seemed to understand, but that viewers could only interpret through context. This had always been part of his character, a deliberate design choice that went back to the real Kenny from Parker's childhood, whose parka made his voice impossible to understand. But as the show developed, as the other characters grew more complex and their relationships became more layered, Kenny's muteness had started to function as a ceiling. There was only so much the show could do with him narratively, only so many stories it could tell that gave him a meaningful role, because the core storytelling tool of dialogue was essentially unavailable to him. He was, as Matt Stone said directly in more than one interview, a prop. A very beloved prop, a prop the audience had genuine affection for, but a prop nonetheless. And props have limited narrative utility. The third factor was Butters. By season 5, the character of Butters Stotch had developed into something the writers had not fully anticipated. He was nervous and sweet and optimistic in a way that was completely distinct from any of the 4 main boys. He was funny in a different register than Cartman or Stan or Kyle or Kenny, and Parker and Stone had begun to feel that Butters deserved more space, more episodes, more of the show's attention than he was getting. The problem was structural. With 4 established main characters already dividing the show's focus, there was limited room for a 5th. Someone would have to move to make space. The original plan, which Parker revealed in the DVD commentary for the season 5 finale, was to kill Kyle, not Kenny. Kyle was the one initially chosen for the permanent departure. The reasoning was that Kyle and Stan were already quite similar, being the 2 most conventionally moral characters in the group, the 2 most likely to take the same side of any argument, the 2 most closely aligned in values and perspective. Since Parker voiced Stan and Stone voiced Kyle, and Parker and Stone were themselves similar in many ways, the characters had developed in parallel in ways that sometimes made them feel redundant to each other. Killing Kyle and replacing him with Butters, who would bring a completely different energy to the group dynamic, seemed like a way to open up new storytelling possibilities. Parker and Stone went into development on the season finale with that plan in mind. They were going to kill Kyle. It was going to be a big moment, a real departure, something that would genuinely surprise an audience that had spent 5 years watching Kenny die without consequence. The death of Kyle would have weight precisely because Kyle was a character who mattered in a different way than Kenny did, a character whose absence would reshape the group's dynamic, whose voice and perspective would genuinely be missed. And then they sat down to write it, and something shifted. Part of what shifted was practical. The episode they were developing, which would become Kenny Dies, was built around a storyline involving stem cell research and the political debate surrounding it at the time. Cartman, in the episode, discovered a truck full of aborted fetuses that have been abandoned in a crash and immediately begins scheming to profit from them, eventually pitching the idea of using them to clone a Shakey's Pizza restaurant. The stem cell angle worked better as a backdrop for a story about Kenny than a story about Kyle, because the emotional core of the episode, a terminally ill child whose death might be prevented by the use of stem cells, fit Kenny's established role in the show more naturally. Kenny dying of a disease was a different kind of Kenny death, a slower and more genuine version, but it was still Kenny dying. Kyle dying of a disease would have been something else entirely. It would have required a different kind of episode, a different emotional register, a different relationship to the show's existing tone. The other thing that shifted was simpler. Parker and Stone realized, as they wrote the scenes of the boys dealing with Kenny's impending death, that the material was genuinely good. They had set out to write something at least partly serious, a departure from the gag format, an attempt to let the recurring death mean something for once. And what they found as they wrote scene after scene of Stan and Kyle sitting with Kenny in the hospital, of the boys struggling to articulate what their friendship meant to them, of the genuine grief of anticipating a loss that they had never been allowed to genuinely feel before, was that the material had real emotional power. Parker described it in the DVD commentary as ending up stupid and ridiculous anyway, because that is just who he and Stone are, and there is truth in that. The episode is not a straightforward tearjerker. The Cartman subplot, involving the fetus trafficking and the Shakey's Pizza cloning, is aggressively absurd and very funny, and runs simultaneously with the emotional Kenny storyline in the way South Park almost always operates, with two tones occupying the same space without either one canceling the other. But the Kenny scenes, taken on their own, are something the show had never quite attempted before. Kenny is in a hospital bed. His face is visible, which is already unusual enough to signal that this is different. He is sick in a way that is not immediately life-threatening, but is clearly serious. A muscular disease that the doctors tell the boys is terminal. He will not recover. He is going to die, not by being crushed by a space station or bitten by a rock star, but by the slow progression of an illness that his body cannot fight. And the boys, for possibly the first time in the show's history, cannot simply wait for the next episode and move on. There is no next episode reset available. The show is telling them and the audience that this is a different kind of death. What is remarkable about the Kenny scenes and Kenny Dies is how well they work given everything the show had spent 5 seasons establishing. The audience had been trained to not care about Kenny's deaths. The show had spent 100 episodes teaching them that caring was the wrong response, that the correct response was to laugh and move on. And yet, watching Kenny in that hospital bed, watching Stan try and fail to visit him because the sight of his friend in that condition is too much for him to bear, watching Kyle sit with him and not know what to say, the trained response of not caring becomes almost impossible to maintain. The show had done too good a job, in the moments scattered across season 4 and in the film, of letting Kenny be a person rather than a prop. The accumulated weight of those moments arrives all at once in Kenny Dies, and it lands. The specific detail that tends to get people is Stan's inability to go in. Stan goes to the hospital, he goes to Kenny's floor, he walks toward the room, and he cannot do it. He turns around, he goes home, and then Kenny dies without Stan having been there to say goodbye. The episode ends with Stan standing outside the hospital, having failed to do the one thing his friend needed from him, and the show does not resolve this. There is no moment where Stan explains himself or apologizes or makes it right. Kenny dies and Stan was not there, and the episode closes on that fact without softening it. That is genuinely sad. Not cartoon sad, actually sad. The kind of sad that comes from recognizing something true in a fictional situation, that people sometimes fail the people they love not out of cruelty but out of an incapacity to face what is happening, and that failure has consequences that cannot always be undone. Stan could not go in, Kenny died. Those two facts sit next to each other in the episode, and the audience has to hold both of them. Matt Stone, speaking to a reporter from the Knoxville News Sentinel in 2002 after the episode aired, said something that has been quoted widely in discussions of this era of the show. He said that Kenny Dies was the one episode where the characters cared that he was dying for once, and that after writing it, the natural question became, why should he not just stay dead? He said it was an easy decision. He said he was sick of the character. He said he could not care less whether anyone noticed. That is Stone performing the same studied indifference that the show had always performed toward Kenny's deaths, applying it now to the decision to end the gag. Whether or not he actually felt that way is impossible to know. What is clear from the episode itself is that someone, Parker or Stone or both of them, cared enough about the material to write something that worked on a genuinely emotional level. You do not accidentally write scenes that make people feel things. You do that on purpose, even if you deny it afterward. The practical decision once made was to keep Kenny dead for the remainder of season 5 and then continue through season 6 without him. Butter stepped into a version of the role that had been vacated, appearing more frequently and taking on storylines that might previously have gone to Kenny. Tweak, another background character with a distinct and funny energy, also received more attention. The show restructured itself around a slightly different central group and found, mostly successfully, that it could function without the death gag. What the decision also meant was that the audience spent the entirety of season 6 in a state of mild uncertainty. Kenny was gone. He had not returned at the beginning of the next episode as he always had. The rules had changed. There was now a possibility, however small, that the show meant it this time, that Kenny was actually gone. The creative team contributed to this uncertainty by leaving traces of Kenny throughout season 6 without bringing him back. His soul, drinking in Cartman's ashes, living inside Cartman's body for several episodes, was present but not present. He was a ghost in the show's machinery, referenced and felt but not restored. The restoration when it came was characteristically quiet. The season 6 finale, Red's Slay Down, ends with Kenny simply appearing at the edge of a scene in its final moments. The boys see him. Stan says, "Oh hey Kenny." Nobody asks where he has been. Nobody mentions the muscular dystrophy, or the hospital, or the death that had dominated the previous season's finale. The slate is clean, Kenny is back. When someone asks where he has been, he gestures vaguely and says he was over there, pointing to his right. Over there, that is the entire explanation. A year of absence, a death that was treated with more seriousness than any previous death in the show's history, and the return is handled with 2 words and a vague gesture. It is simultaneously the funniest and the most South Park possible way to bring him back, and it works precisely because it refuses to make the return into anything more significant than the departures had ever been. The show had always treated Kenny's deaths as unremarkable. It treated his return with the same economy. The consistency was the joke, and the joke was perfect. But Kenny was different after this. The death gag continued, but it no longer ran every episode. Deaths became events rather than obligations, spread across seasons rather than concentrated into every installment. The show had found that it could use Kenny's deaths more effectively when they were rare. A death that happens once a season carries weight that a death that happens every week cannot. The audience notices it more. The show can afford to be more creative with it because the pressure of a weekly deadline is gone. The deaths after season 6 are, taken individually, often more inventive and more emotionally resonant than many of the golden era deaths, precisely because the show is no longer producing them in bulk. What season 5 and the Kenny Dies episode established more than anything else was that the gag had always had more underneath it than the gag. The death was funny, but the boy dying was something else. And the show, having finally let those 2 things separate and examined each one individually, could never quite put them back together the same way again. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Section 4 uncovered the decision that ended the weekly death fest, the exhaustion, the almost killing of Kyle, the episode that made people actually feel something about a character they had been trained not to care about. Section 5 moves into what came after. Kenny's quiet return, the late era deaths that landed differently because they were no longer routine, and the remarkable final chapter of his story in the post-COVID specials, where his death became the most significant plot point in the show's recent history. Section 5, the return, the rarity, and the deaths that still landed. There is something strange about watching a show rediscover a character it had been using for years. Strange because the character has not changed. The design is the same, the voice is the same, the orange parka is the same, but the context around the character has shifted, and that shift changes what the character can do, what weight the character can carry, what the audience is able to feel when the character appears on screen. Kenny McCormick after season 6 was the same Kenny McCormick who had died 98 times in the first 5 seasons, but he was operating in a different relationship with the show and with the audience, and that different relationship produced some of the most interesting Kenny material in the show's entire run. The return itself, as described in the previous section, was handled with deliberate understatement, 2 words and a vague gesture. Over there. The show made no ceremony of it, offered no explanation, and treated the return with exactly the same casual indifference it had always applied to Kenny's death. This consistency was the correct instinct. Making a big deal of Kenny's return would have implied that his absence had been a big deal, and making his absence a big deal would have retroactively changed the meaning of all the deaths that preceded it. The show understood that the logic of the Kenny gag depended on a specific kind of tonal flatness. The world does not pause, does not commemorate, does not explain, and that applying that flatness equally to the departures and returns was the only way to maintain the internal consistency that made the gag work. But something had genuinely changed, and that something became apparent in the episode. episodes that followed. The deaths, when they came, hit differently. They had breathing room now. They were not competing with next week's death for the audience's attention, were not being accumulated into a blur of repetition where each individual death lost definition against the mass of deaths surrounding it. Each post-season 6 Kenny death was, in a sense, its own event. The audience had time to notice it, to absorb it, to remember it. And the writers, freed from the weekly production pressure that had eventually ground the golden era into a kind of mechanical routine, had time to be more intentional about when and how they used the death. The first truly memorable post-return Kenny death comes from season 9, and it is the one that most clearly demonstrates what the rarity had made possible. The episode is Best Friends Forever, which aired in 2005, and it is one of the most structurally ambitious things the show ever did with Kenny as a character. The episode begins with Kenny being the first person in South Park to purchase a newly released PlayStation Portable. He is immediately obsessed with it. He plays it constantly. He reaches level 60 of the game it comes with, a game called Heaven vs. Hell, and he is hit by an ice cream truck and killed while celebrating outside because his parents were arguing and he had to finish the final level somewhere quieter. This is on the surface a fairly standard post-return Kenny death. The cause is absurd. The timing is darkly comic. The immediate response of the people around him is muted and brief. All of the formal elements of the classic death gag are present, but then the episode continues in a direction no previous Kenny death had ever gone. Kenny's soul goes to heaven, and in heaven, the angels tell him something that reframes everything the audience thought they knew about his relationship to death. God, according to the episode, created the PlayStation Portable, not as a consumer electronics product, but as a divine instrument, a tool designed specifically to identify the one person in all of humanity with the tactical and strategic skills to command heaven's armies against the forces of hell. The game built into the system, Heaven vs. Hell, was a test. Kenny passed the test. He reached the highest level. He is in the language the angels use there, Keanu Reeves. He is the chosen one, the figure who can stand between heaven and infinite destruction and hold the line. There is an enormous amount going on in that premise, and most of it is comedy. The idea that God would design a video game console to run a divine talent search is absurd in a specifically South Park way, deadpan and elaborate and committed to its own internal logic in a way that makes the absurdity feel almost reasonable. The Keanu Reeves framing is a joke about celebrity and about the specific kind of heroism that pop culture has attached to that name through the Matrix film. All of that is funny, and the episode delivers the comedy with confidence. But underneath the comedy, the episode is doing something that quietly changes the terms of Kenny's entire existence. It is suggesting that Kenny's death in this episode was not accidental, that the ice cream truck was not random bad luck in an unfeeling universe, that Kenny was meant to die at this specific moment, that his death was a necessary step in a divine plan that had been in motion since before his birth, that the PlayStation Portable he happened to purchase was not a product he happened to want, but an instrument of a larger design placed in his path with intention. Kenny did not die because the universe is indifferent and things happen. Kenny died because he was supposed to die, because dying and what came after dying was what he was built for. This is a disturbing implication when you apply it retrospectively to all the preceding deaths. If Kenny was always meant to die in this episode, if his death was always part of a plan, then what were the previous 98 deaths? Were they also planned? Was every Kenny death in every previous episode a step in a divine sequence leading to this moment? Was the antacid tablet part of the plan? Was Ozzy Osbourne's bite part of the plan? Was death personally touching Kenny in season 1 not arbitrary but intentional? The first calculated move in a process that was always going to end with Kenny standing in heaven, holding a golden PlayStation Portable, commanding angels against hell? The episode does not answer these questions. It raises them obliquely through the mechanics of its plot, and then it moves on. South Park is not a show that sits with its own implication, but the questions are real, and they change the texture of every death that came before, transforming what looked like randomness into something that might have been pattern all along. The plot of the episode then takes a different direction entirely. Kenny is killed. His body, rather than vanishing as it usually does, remains and is discovered in a persistent vegetative state kept alive by the hospital's machinery. The episode becomes a parody of the Terry Schiavkovo case, which was a real and deeply divisive political controversy happening in America at the time of the episode's airing, involving a woman in a persistent vegetative state whose husband and parents disagreed about whether she should be kept alive or allowed to die. South Park transplants that controversy directly onto Kenny, with Cartman campaigning aggressively for Kenny's death so he can collect Kenny's PlayStation Portable, which Kenny left to him in his will out of pity, and Stan and Kyle campaigning for Kenny's continued survival. The episode won South Park its first Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated animated program, which is notable because it is an episode built around a Kenny death. The Emmy was recognizing something the industry had perhaps not previously associated with South Park: craft. The episode is carefully constructed. It holds multiple tones simultaneously without letting any of them collapse the others. It is farcical and political and quietly emotional and darkly funny in a way that requires genuine control. And at the center of all of it is Kenny, whose death and subsequent vegetative state drive every element of the plot, whose will is read aloud, and whose wishes matter to the narrative in a way that earlier episodes never permitted. The Will is a small masterpiece of character writing. Kenny left detailed instructions about what he wanted. He left his possessions to Stan and Kyle. He left the PlayStation Portable specifically to Cartman, out of what the Will describes as pity, with a note that Cartman never really had any real friends and that Kenny felt sorry for him. The Will reveals a Kenny who was paying attention, who saw clearly the dynamics of his friendships, who had enough interiority to articulate complex feelings about the people in his life, even though the show had never given him a clear voice to express those feelings in. The Will is what Kenny would have said if anyone had ever asked him, and the fact that they only received it after his death is both a joke and something slightly more than a joke. Kenny is eventually allowed to die and returns to heaven just in time to use the golden PlayStation Portable to command the angels to victory. His reward for saving all of existence is a golden statue of Keanu Reeves. He accepts it. The episode ends. It is one of the finest half hours of television the show ever produced, and it is built entirely around a Kenny death, which tells you something about what the rarity had made possible. Moving forward through the later seasons, the Kenny deaths that land most effectively are the ones that use the rarity deliberately. Season 11 has only one Kenny death in the entire season, and it is used to maximum effect. The episode is called The List, and the death is the stray bullet one mentioned in the research phase of this essay. Kenny is at the dinner table with his family, eating Pop-Tarts for dinner because that is what the McCormick family eats. Somewhere across town, two characters are in a confrontation involving a gun. The gun goes off. The bullet travels an impossible distance, passes through the window of the McCormick house, and hits Kenny in the head while he is eating. He dies at the table. His family continues eating. The death works so well because of everything surrounding it. The entire episode has had nothing to do with Kenny's death. The storyline is about a list that ranks the boys from cutest to ugliest, and the social chaos that results from the list's existence. Kenny has been present throughout the episode, but not particularly central to it. And then, with no warning and no setup, he is killed by a bullet that had nothing to do with him, fired in a confrontation he was not part of, traveling across town to find him specifically while he sat at his own dinner table. The arbitrariness is total. The universe killed him during dinner with a stray bullet for no reason. His family does not react. The episode ends shortly afterward. That death in isolation is funny, but season 11, having used its single Kenny death on something that random and that specific, gives the death a particular quality. The show has been careful all season, saving its one death for the right moment, and the right moment turned out to be this: a boy eating Pop-Tarts at a table his family can barely afford to feed, killed by a bullet intended for someone else, in an episode about social hierarchies and who gets to be called attractive. The comedy and the bleakness are perfectly balanced, and neither one wins. The pandemic special, which aired in 2020, gave Kenny a death that resonated in ways that previous deaths had not, because of the specific historical moment it occupied. The episode is set during the early months of the COVID pandemic, when the real world was processing lockdowns and fear, and the militarized response to public health crises. The boys in the episode are desperate to return to school and escape the suffocating conditions of quarantine. They make a run for it. The police, equipped with military hardware in the episode's satirical logic, open fire. Kenny is shot and killed. A child in an orange parka shot by police in 2020. The show did not editorialize about it. It did not underline it. It presented it within the episode's comic logic and moved on. But the image carried weight that went beyond the episode's satirical target, weight that anyone watching in 2020 would have felt regardless of how the show intended it. Kenny's death has always had a socioeconomic dimension, always been connected to what it means to be poor and peripheral and unremarkable enough for the world to absorb your suffering without comment. The pandemic special death activated that dimension more directly than any previous death had, using the specific political and social vocabulary of that particular moment in American history. And then there is the post-COVID material, the two-part special released in 2021 on Paramount Plus, which represents the most ambitious use of Kenny's death in the show's history. The specials are set 40 years in the future, and the inciting event of the entire story is that Kenny McCormick is dead, not killed by a random accident, not dispatched in the first act for a quick joke. Kenny is dead, and his death is a mystery, and his death is what reunites the show's main characters after decades of estrangement. The Kenny of the future is remarkable. He has become a scientist, a humanitarian, a Nobel laureate, a philanthropist. He has used the wealth and the education and the time that his childhood circumstances denied him to build a life of extraordinary purpose. He is, by any conventional measure, the most successful of the 4 boys in adulthood. He dedicated his life to understanding and solving the problems that affect the people around him, which is entirely consistent with the heroic streak that ran through the character even in his earliest appearances, even when he was just a prop being killed for laughs. The boy who sacrificed himself in the 1999 film so that everyone else could continue living became, in the adult version of the story, a man who spent his life trying to do the same thing at a larger scale. His death in the post-COVID special is caused by a time travel experiment that went wrong. Kenny had been trying to go back to the origins of the pandemic, trying to find the source, trying to understand, and ultimately prevent the chain of events that had fractured his friendships and damaged his world. He contracted a new COVID variant during the experiment and brought it back to the present, dying in the process. He did not survive to see whether his sacrifice accomplished anything. What the specials reveal and what makes them the most interesting Kenny material the show has produced in years is the message Kenny left behind. On a flash drive hidden, where only his closest friend would find it, Kenny recorded himself explaining what he had been trying to do and why. He wanted to go back in time. He wanted to fix things. Not primarily because of the pandemic, which had been terrible, but because the pandemic had broken apart his friendship, had separated him from the people he loved, and he believed that the world they were all living in 40 years later was worse because of that separation. He died trying to save a friendship. He died as he had died in the 1999 film for the people around him. Continuity of that impulse across 20 years of storytelling is striking. Kenny, from the film to the specials, has consistently been the character who gives up his own continuation for the benefit of others. He does it in the film. He does it in Best Friends Forever. He does it in the post-COVID special. The character who was introduced as a prop, as something to be killed for a cheap laugh and forgotten by the next episode, became across the slow accumulation of the show's history the character most consistently defined by self-sacrifice. The boy nobody remembered dying was the one who kept dying for everyone else. There is something in that pattern that the show never quite articulated directly, but that the pattern itself makes visible. Kenny's deaths were always treated as meaningless by the world around him. The show's comedy depended on that meaninglessness. But the show also kept, in its quieter moments, demonstrating that the deaths were not meaningless to Kenny. He remembered them. He experienced them. He woke up from them and put the parka back on and went outside and did it again. And he kept, despite all of that, making choices that put him in the path of death for the sake of others. That is not a prop. That is a hero who nobody recognizes as one, in a world that has decided his suffering does not require a response. The joke and the tragedy have been the same thing all along, and it took the show 24 seasons to arrive at a version of Kenny's death that made that visible. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Section 5 closed the left side of this essay with late era deaths, an Emmy, a future Nobel laureate, and a man who died trying to save a friendship. Section 6 moves into the theories, the unanswered questions, the lore the show built and never resolved, starting with the most disturbing one, what it actually feels like to be Kenny McCormick. Section 6, the theory that Kenny knows everything and is trapped there is a scene in the episode Coon vs. Coon and Friends, which aired in season 14, that does not get discussed nearly as often as it should. It is not a long scene. It does not have elaborate animation or a complicated setup. It is just Kenny, unhooded, speaking clearly, saying something that reframes every single episode of South Park that came before it. He is talking to his friends. He is explaining what his life is actually like, and what he describes in the language of a child, but with the exhaustion of someone who has been carrying something impossible for a very long time, is one of the most quietly disturbing things the show ever put on screen. He tells them that he died, that he dies all the time, that every time it happens he wakes up in his bed the next morning and nobody remembered, that he has told people before and nobody believes him, that he has been experiencing this, alone with full awareness, for as long as he can remember. And then he says, with a frustration that has clearly been building for years, all the time, I die all the time, and you assholes never remember. The line gets a laugh. It is structured to get a laugh. The show is a comedy, and it frames even its most disturbing revelations inside comedic delivery. But the laugh, when it comes, sits on top of something genuinely hard to look at directly, because what Kenny is describing in that scene is not a superpower. It is not an adventure. It is not even a particularly interesting curse in the dramatic sense of curses, where the afflicted person gets to be mysterious and tragic and ultimately compelling because of what they endure. What Kenny is describing is something much more ordinary scary and much more terrible than any of those things. He is describing the experience of being invisible, of suffering something real repeatedly, and having the people closest to him fail to register it every single time. That experience has a name outside of cartoon logic. It is the experience of people whose pain is chronic and therefore unremarkable. People whose circumstances are so consistently difficult that the people around them stop noticing, stop asking, stop treating each incident of difficulties as something that requires a response. The suffering becomes background noise. It becomes part of the furniture of who that person is, assumed rather than acknowledged, present without being seen. Kenny has been dying and returning and dying again for the entire run of the show, and the people who are supposed to be his closest friends have never once held that. They have never once said, "This keeps happening to you, and we are sorry, and we see it, and it matters." They say, "Oh my god, they killed Kenny," and then they say, "You bastards," and then they move on. The theory this section is concerned with is not exactly a fan theory in the traditional sense, because the show has provided enough canon material to make it less of a speculation and more of a conclusion drawn from evidence the show itself supplied. The theory is this: Kenny McCormick is fully aware of everything that happens to him. He retains complete memory across every death and every rebirth. He knows how many times he has died. He knows the specific circumstances of each death. He knows that nobody around him remembers, and he knows that this is his permanent condition, that it will not change, that he cannot opt out of it, that he cannot transfer it to someone else, that he cannot find a way to make the people around him retain what they keep losing. He is trapped inside a cycle that the universe has imposed on him, and he is the only one who can see the cage. The canon evidence for this is spread across multiple episodes, and it is consistent enough to constitute something the show intended rather than something that emerged accidentally from continuity errors. In the season 5 episode Cartman Joins Nambla, Kenny is killed multiple times within a single episode, and between each death there are moments where his behavior suggests awareness of what is happening. He does not seem surprised. He seems resigned, which is a different thing. Surprise implies that the event was unexpected. Resignation implies that the event was expected and has been expected many times before and will be expected again. In the season 7 episode It's Christmas in Canada, when the boys are preparing to board a plane, Kenny refuses. His response, translated through the context of the scene, is clear. He will die if he gets on that plane. Kyle tells him he is not going to die, that he is being stupid. Kenny does not get on the plane. He survives the episode. This is a significant moment because it demonstrates not just awareness, but predictive awareness. Kenny is not simply remembering deaths that have already happened. He is anticipating deaths that have not happened yet, using the accumulated knowledge of his previous deaths to identify situations that are likely to kill him and avoid them when possible. He has developed through sheer repetition a kind of expertise in his own mortality that no other character possesses, and that no other character could possess because no other character has the memory of it. In Best Friends Forever, Kenny's will begins with the phrase "in the likely chance of my demise." He wrote a will. He planned for his own death with enough specificity and enough certainty that he drafted legal documents in anticipation of it. An 8-year-old child from a poor family in Colorado drafted a legal will because he knew with complete certainty that he was going to die and that the people around him would need instructions about what to do with his thing. That is not the behavior of someone who is surprised by death. That is the behavior of someone who has integrated death into the practical logistics of their daily life. The Christmas special from season 1 contains a moment that is easy to miss but worth stopping on. At the end of the episode, when the boys have survived intact and the credits are approaching, Kenny looks around, realizes he has made it through an entire episode without dying, and visibly celebrates. He cheers. He is genuinely happy about this. The happiness is the reveal. You are only happy about surviving if you expected not to. You only celebrate not dying if dying was the default outcome you had learned to anticipate. Kenny's celebration at the end of that Christmas episode is the earliest evidence the show provided that he knew what was happening to him. He had already, by the end of season 1, developed an awareness that his death was the expected outcome of most situations he found himself in, and the absence of that death was something worth marking. All of this canon evidence builds toward the Mysterian trilogy in season 14, which is where the show finally addressed the question of Kenny's awareness directly and in explicit terms. Kenny is revealed as Mysterian, the masked vigilante whose superpower the show had been building toward across several episodes, and when the mask comes off and Kenny explains what his power actually is, what he describes is not what most superhero origin stories describe. He does not describe strength or speed or the ability to fly or any of the conventional attributes that superhero narratives attach to the word power. He describes something that sounds, when you listen to it carefully, almost entirely like a punishment. He cannot die permanently. When he dies, he wakes wakes up in his bed, nobody remembers. He has no control over when it happens or how it happens or how long it takes for him to wake up after it happens. He does not know whether there is a version of dying that could end the cycle. He does not know whether he will ever be free of it. He just knows that it keeps happening and that he is the only one who carries the memory of it happening, and that the isolation of being the sole keeper of that memory is its own particular kind of suffering on top of the physical suffering of the deaths themselves. He then shoots himself in the head in front of his friends to demonstrate what he means. That moment is played for dark comedy, and it works as dark comedy. But what Kenny is doing when he shoots himself is something that deserves more attention than the comedy around it tends to allow. He is demonstrating his condition to people who have witnessed it hundreds of times and still do not believe it. He is using the most extreme possible evidence, the most undeniable physical proof available, to try to make the people closest to him finally see what his life is. He has tried telling them, they do not retain it. He has died in front of them repeatedly. They do not retain it. The only option he has left is to die deliberately and immediately and make the demonstration so direct that it cannot be absorbed and forgotten the way everything else has been absorbed and forgotten. And of course, they forget. They always forget. That is the condition. That is what makes it a trap rather than simply an inconvenience. The theory that extends beyond what the show explicitly provides, the part that moves from canon evidence into genuine speculation, concerns the subjective experience of Kenny's awareness. The show tells us he remembers, it tells us he knows, but it does not spend much time inside what that actually feels like, what the texture of that awareness is, what it means to wake up in your bed after having died and to carry the full memory of the death and the death before it and every death before that, stretching back to whenever the cycle began. The speculation, grounded in the canon material, goes something like this. Kenny does not just remember dying. He remembers everything that happened between the deaths as well. Every conversation, every friendship, every moment of joy or boredom, or frustration or connection. He accumulates experience in the way that all people accumulate experience, through the slow layering of memory over time. But his accumulation is not organized the way normal memory is organized, around a single continuous life moving in one direction. His accumulation is organized around a cycle, around an experience that begins and ends and begins again, around a self that keeps being interrupted and restarted and interrupted again. What does that do to a person over time? What does it do to your sense of self, to your relationship with the concept of continuity, to your understanding of what friendship means when the people you call your friends lose you and regain you and lose you again without ever knowing it is happening? What does it mean to love people who cannot hold your experience, who cannot grieve you, who cannot mark your absence because your absence is invisible to them? There is a version of this that sounds almost peaceful, a fresh start every time. No accumulated grievances, no weight of history dragging at each new morning. Wake up, park on, bus stop, new day. But the freshness is not mutual. Kenny is not fresh. Kenny carries every previous day. He arrives at each new morning already full of everything that came before, and the people he arrives to meet are empty of it. He is always older than they know. He is always carrying more than they can see. He is the only person in South Park who is genuinely measurably aging in experience, even as the show keeps everyone frozen in time. That asymmetry, Kenny full of accumulated experience and everyone around him perpetually reset, is the most disturbing element of his condition when examined closely. It means that every relationship Kenny has is, from his perspective, a relationship with people who do not fully know him. They know the version of him that exists in their memory, which is incomplete. They do not know the version that has died in front of them dozens of times and woken up and come back and tried again. They do not know the version that has been afraid and in pain and alone with that fear and pain in a way that no other living creature in South Park has ever been alone with anything. Kenny knows his friends. His friends do not fully know Kenny. That gap is permanent. It cannot be closed. The cycle ensures it. And Kenny, who is aware of the cycle, is aware of the gap and lives inside it every single day. The Will in Best Friends Forever said, "In the likely chance of my demise." A child wrote those words. A child from a poor family, in a small house, with parents who argued and drank and barely managed, sat down at some point and wrote legal instructions for what to do when he died, because he knew with certainty that he would die, and that the people around him would need guidance he could not give them in person because he would already be gone. That child was not being morbid. He was being practical. He had learned through the accumulated evidence of his own asphyxiance that preparation was the only control he had over something that was otherwise entirely outside his control. That is not a superpower. That is a child who has made peace, or something close to peace, with a condition that would break most people. Who has found a way to keep going back to the bus stop, to keep standing with his friends, to keep participating in a world that will not remember him when he leaves it, because the alternative is to stop going back. And Kenny, for all of the deaths and all all of the rebirths and all of the forgetting has never stopped going back. He goes back every time. He puts the parka on and he goes back. And that, underneath everything, is the most remarkable thing about him. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Section 6 examined what it actually means to be Kenny, aware, alone with that awareness, carrying every death while the world resets around him. Section 7 moves into the canon lore the show provided to explain why this happens at all. The Cthulhu cult, the midnight rebirth, the mother who wakes screaming and places a newborn in a bed and goes back to sleep, and what that explanation reveals about whether Kenny's immortality was ever meant for him in the first place. Section 7, the Cthulhu cult, the reborn mother, and what the show actually explains most mystery eventually gets an answer. Not always a satisfying one, not always a complete one, but something, a reason, a cause. A moment where the show turns to face the question it has been quietly accumulating and says, here is what is happening, and here is why. South Park gave Kenny that moment in season 14, inside the Mysterian trilogy, and the answer it provided was stranger and more unsettling than most fans had anticipated. Not because it was complicated, because it was so small. The explanation begins with Kenny's parents. Stuart and Carol McCormick are not, by any reasonable measure, people who sought out cosmic significance. They are a couple living in poverty in a small Colorado town, drinking too much, arguing frequently, barely managing the practical requirements of keeping a household running. They are not mystics, they are not seekers. They did not set out to participate in anything larger than their own difficult daily life. But at some point, in the years before the show's timeline begins, they attended meetings of a cult that worshipped the ancient cosmic entity Cthulhu, drawn from the horror fiction of H.P. Lovecraft. They attended, according to the show's canon, for the free alcohol, not for enlightenment, not for power, not for any reason connected to belief or intention or spiritual hunger. They went because the drinks were free, and they liked to drink. That detail is the key to everything. The McCormicks did not choose what happened to Kenny. They stumbled into it. They sat in a room with people performing rituals connected to an entity of incomprehensible cosmic power, drank whatever was available, went home, and continued their lives. Whatever the cult did, whatever the meetings involved, whatever the connection to Cthulhu activated or invited or set in motion, it happened to them passively. They were not participants in any meaningful sense. They were bodies in a room, present but not engaged, consuming the free alcohol and leaving. And their son became immortal. The specific mechanics of Kenny's rebirth are shown in the episode Coon vs. Coon and Friend, and they are worth describing precisely because the precision is where the horror lives. When Kenny dies, his mother Carol wakes in the night. She wakes screaming. The show implies, from something she feels rather than something she sees. She gets up. She gives birth to a newborn. She places the newborn in Kenny's bed. She goes back to sleep. By morning, the newborn has aged back to Kenny's proper age and is wearing the orange parka and is, as far as anyone in the household is concerned, simply Kenny. Carol returns to bed after placing the infant down and says to her husband that they never should have gone to those stupid cult meetings. Stuart does not respond. They go back to sleep. That scene runs for less than a minute. It is presented without dramatic lighting or musical emphasis. It is shot with the same flat visual register the show applies to almost everything, and it is one of the most disturbing things South Park ever filmed. Think about what it actually described. A woman wakes in the night, in pain, having just lost a child she may or may not consciously remember losing, and immediately gives birth to a replacement. She does not grieve. She does not have time to grieve. The cycle does not allow for grief. It simply restarts immediately with her body as the instrument of the restart. She is not a participant in Kenny's immortality in any chosen sense. She is the mechanism of it. Her body is the tool through which the curse, or the blessing, or whatever the cult's connection to Cthulhu produced, perpetuates itself. She wakes, she delivers, she places the child, she goes back to sleep. Over and over for as long as Kenny keeps dying, which is constantly. Carol's comment that they never should have gone to those stupid cult meetings contains the entire tragedy of the McCormick family in a single sentence. She is not angry at Cthulhu. She is not terrified of the cosmic implications of what her family has been caught inside. She is tired. She is inconvenienced. She is a woman who made a minor, thoughtless decision years ago and has been paying for it in the most intimate possible currency ever since, with her body in the middle of the night repeatedly without end. The stupidity of the original decision, going to cult meetings for free drinks, and the enormity of the consequence, burying your son over and over again forever, are so disproportionate to each other that the scene tips into something almost unbearable. What the Cthulhu explanation also does, and this is where the canon lore becomes genuinely interesting as a piece of world building, is locate the source of Kenny's condition entirely outside of Kenny himself. He did not choose this. He did not earn it. He did not seek it out or perform any action that invited it. He was born into it, literally, because his parents went to to the wrong meetings before he existed. The immortality that defines his entire life, that shapes every relationship he has and every experience he accumulates and every death he endures, was given to him without his knowledge or consent by a decision his parents made for free alcohol. He is trapped in a cosmic cycle that began as an accident of someone else's thirst. That is a specific kind of injustice that the show never quite names, but that the structure of the explanation makes visible. Kenny bears the full weight of a consequence he had no part in creating. He wakes up from every death, carries the memory of it, goes back to the world, and continues, because the alternative is to stop continuing, and there is no clear mechanism by which he could even choose to stop. The cycle is not his, he just lives inside it. The question the show raises, but does not answer, is whether the connection to Cthulhu means anything beyond the mechanical fact of the rebirth. Cthulhu, in Lovecraft's original fiction, is not a deity in any conventional sense. It is an entity of such incomprehensible scale and indifference that the concept of intention, of purpose, of meaning does not apply to it in any human sense. If Cthulhu's cult meetings produced Kenny's immortality, that does not mean Cthulhu intended it. It does not mean there is a plan. It does not mean Kenny's deaths and rebirths are steps in some larger cosmic sequence. It might mean simply that proximity to something that large and that indifferent produces effects that have no meaning at all. That Kenny's condition is not a gift or a curse, but a side effect. Collateral damage from a family that wandered into the orbit of something vast and came away changed in ways nobody designed and nobody wanted. That reading, Kenny as cosmic collateral damage, is the most disturbing version of the Cthulhu explanation because it removes even the comfort of significance. If Kenny's immortality is part of a plan, if there is a reason he keeps dying and returning, then his suffering is at least in service of something. The Best Friends Forever episode supports this reading, with its suggestion that Kenny was always meant to be Heaven's chosen commander, but the Cthulhu explanation, taken on its own terms, does not support it. The Cthulhu explanation suggests accident all the way down. Parents, free alcohol, cult meeting, cosmic proximity, consequence, no intention, no design. Just a family that went somewhere they should not have gone, and a child who has been paying for it in ways they cannot fully see or understand, or even remember clearly enough to feel appropriately sorry about. Carol goes back to sleep. Stuart does not respond. Kenny puts the parka on in the morning and goes to the bus stop, and none of them, not one member of that household, has any meaningful power over any of it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Section 7 laid out everything the show quietly built around Kenny's immortality: the cult, the alcohol, the mother, and the cosmic weight nobody in that family asked to carry. Next section moves outward from the McCormick house into the town itself and asks whether South Park's permanent frozen state is something Kenny's cycle created and continues to maintain. Section 8, the theory that South Park is purgatory and Kenny is the proof. There is something wrong with South Park, Colorado that goes beyond the weekly disasters and the celebrity appearances and the political controversies that blow through town and vanish by the following episode. Something structural. Something that operates underneath the surface noise of the show's plots and only becomes visible when you step back far enough to look at the whole picture rather than any individual piece of it. The town does not move. The characters do not age. Events of enormous consequence happen and are absorbed and forgotten with a completeness that real communities never manage. People die and return. The same arguments recur. The same lessons are learned and unlearned. South Park is a place that resets constantly and completely. And the question that a significant body of fan theory has been asking for years is why? The theory this section addresses is one of the more ambitious attempts to answer that question. It proposes that South Park is not simply a fictional town in Colorado that the writers reset between episodes for convenience. It proposes that South Park is a form of purgatory, a place where souls who are not ready for either heaven or hell are sent to wait, to cycle, to be slowly processed toward whatever comes next. A place that looks like a normal small town but functions underneath its surface as a holding environment for people who have not yet resolved whatever it is that keeps them from moving on. The evidence the theory draws on is spread across the show's entire run and is more substantial than most fan theories manage to assemble. The first piece of evidence is the town's relationship with supernatural entities. Jesus Christ lives in South Park. He hosts a television program there. Satan has visited South Park multiple times, sometimes to fight, sometimes to attend parties, once to try to conquer the earth from a base of operations that was disturbingly close to town. Death himself appeared in season 1 and walked through the streets looking for someone to take. These are not entities that typically have a casual relationship with ordinary American town. Their presence in South Park, their familiarity with it, their repeated return to it suggests that the town occupies a particular position in whatever cosmology the show has constructed. It is a place these figures know, a place they have have reason to visit, a place that is in some sense part of their jurisdiction. The second piece of evidence is the forgetting. South Park's residents forget things at a rate that is impossible to explain through normal human psychology. They forget Kenny's deaths, obviously, but they also forget enormous community-wide events. Disasters that would scar a real town for generations are absorbed and processed and gone within an episode. The citizens of South Park do not accumulate trauma in the way that real communities accumulate trauma. They reset, and a purgatory would need exactly that mechanism, a forgetting function that prevents souls from becoming so burdened by accumulated experience that they cannot continue the process of whatever they are there to work through. The third piece of evidence, and the one most directly relevant to Kenny, is the aging problem. South Park has been on the air since 1997. The boys were in 3rd grade when the show began. They moved to 4th grade in the early seasons and have remained in 4th grade ever since, across nearly 30 years of episodes. Time passes in the show. Elections happen, pandemics happen, cultural moments are referenced with enough specificity to place episodes in particular years, but the characters do not age to match the time passing. They are frozen, permanently 8 or 9 years old, permanently in the same grade, permanently in the same relationships with the same people in the same town. This is in most animated shows simply a production decision. Characters do not age because aging creates continuity problems and limits storytelling flexibility. But the purgatory theory proposes that within the logic of South Park's world, the aging problem is not a production decision but a feature of the environment. Souls in purgatory do not age toward death because they are already past death. They exist in a suspended state, working through whatever they need to work through, unable to move forward until whatever condition keeps them there has been resolved. Which brings the theory directly to Kenny. The fan theory that connects Kenny's immortality to the town's frozen state was articulated clearly by a Reddit user and gained significant traction in South Park fan community. The argument goes as follows. Kenny's rebirth cycle requires time. When Kenny dies, his mother gives birth to a newborn. That newborn ages back to Kenny's proper age, which is 8 or 9 years old, within the space of a few hours or overnight. For a newborn to age 9 years in a matter of hours, time must be moving at an extraordinary rate for Kenny specifically. But Kenny does not experience those hours as 9 years. He wakes up as himself at his proper age with his memories intact. The aging happens outside of his subjective experience. The theory proposes that this rapid aging does not happen in isolation, that when Kenny's cycle demands time, it takes that time from the surrounding environment, that each of Kenny's rebirths effectively borrows years from the town's timeline and uses them to reconstitute Kenny, leaving the town itself slightly more frozen, slightly more arrested, slightly less able to move forward through time in the normal way. Over 100 deaths and rebirths across nearly 30 years of episodes, the cumulative effect of this borrowing would be enormous. The town would be deeply structurally frozen. The characters would be unable to age. Time would pass in the sense that external events could still occur. Elections, pandemics, cultural shifts, but the internal clock of South Park's residents would be arrested, held in place by the repeated demands of Kenny's cycle, pulling temporal energy away from the community and redirecting it toward his reconstitution. This theory is not canon. The show has never confirmed it, never referenced it, never built an episode around it. It is speculation, grounded in canon details, but extending beyond what the show explicitly provides. What makes it interesting is not that it is provably true, but that it fits the available evidence with a neatness that most fan theories do not manage. It explains the aging problem. It explains the forgetting. It gives Kenny's deaths a consequence that extends beyond his own experience and touches every other character in the show, connecting his personal tragedy to the larger strangeness of the town in a way that makes both more coherent. It also makes Kenny, once again, the load-bearing character, the one whose condition shapes everything around him without anyone being aware of it. The show has always used Kenny this way narratively. He is the character whose death drives plots, whose sacrifice enables resolutions, whose absence in season 6 reorganized the show's entire structure. The purgatory theory simply extends that narrative centrality into the show's cosmology. Kenny is not just important to individual episodes. He is, according to this reading, important to the continued existence of South Park itself. The town needs him to keep dying and returning because his cycle is what maintains the frozen state that allows everyone else to remain. Without Kenny's deaths, without the regular borrowing of time that his rebirths require, the town might begin to move again. Characters might begin to age. The purgatory, if that is what it is, might begin to resolve. The theory also adds a dimension to the relationship between Kenny and the other residents of South Park that is genuinely uncomfortable to sit with. The townspeople, by this reading, are unwitting beneficiaries of Kenny's suffering. Every time he dies, they get to stay frozen. Every time he is reborn, the clock that would otherwise push them them toward aging and consequence, and the eventual resolution of whatever keeps them in South Park is reset. They do not know this is happening. They cannot know it because the forgetting mechanism prevents them from accumulating the kind of awareness that would let them see the pattern. But their comfortable stasis, their ability to remain in the same town with the same relationships and the same grade at school and the same unresolved issues year after year, is purchased by something Kenny pays for with his body over and over again. He subsidizes their frozen lives with his deaths, and none of them remember enough to thank him for it. That reading connects the purgatory theory back to the economic and social dimension of Kenny's character that has been present since Trey Parker based him on a real poor child who wore an orange parka and kept disappearing and coming back. The poor kid from the struggling family, the one whose suffering the community absorbs without registering it as suffering, is the one whose condition enables everyone else's comfort. That is not a new story. It is one of the oldest stories there is, about who bears the cost of a system and who receives the benefits, about whose pain is visible and whose is treated as part of the background. South Park has always been doing something with Kenny that touches that story, and the purgatory theory simply makes the structure of that something explicit. Whether or not the writers intended any of this is a question that probably does not have a clean answer. Parker and Stone have been consistently irreverent about the show's mythology, dismissive of deep readings, resistant to the idea that South Park is doing anything more than what it appears to be doing on the surface. But the material they created across 30 years of episodes contains patterns that exceed what accident or coincidence can account for. Kenny at the center of those patterns. Kenny as the figure whose condition connects the cosmic and the personal and the socioeconomic is not something that was planned in a writer's room in 1997. It accumulated. It grew out of decisions made for separate practical reasons that happened to rhyme with each other in ways that produced something larger than any individual decision. The town stays frozen. Kenny keeps dying. Nobody ages. Nobody remembers. And somewhere in the McCormick house, on nights when the cycle demands it, a woman wakes up screaming, and the process begins again. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Section 8 explored the theory that South Park itself is a purgatory maintained by Kenny's cycle of death and rebirth, with every resident unknowingly sustained by a suffering they cannot seize or remember. Section 9 moves into the strangest relationship in the show's history, the deeply unsettling connection between Kenny and Cartman, built through eye transplants, consumed ashes, a shared body, and a theory about what all of that physical entanglement actually gave Cartman access to. Section 9, the Cartman connection and what he actually knows. There is no relationship in South Park more complicated than the one between Eric Cartman and Kenny McCormick. It does not look complicated on the surface. On the surface, it looks like the relationship between a manipulative, selfish child and the poorest kid in his social group, a dynamic defined by Cartman, exploiting Kenny's financial vulnerability by offering him small amounts of money to do degrading or dangerous things. Cartman has Kenny perform tasks for cash throughout the early seasons. He leverages Kenny's poverty as a tool. He treats Kenny's financial desperation as a resource to be used rather than a condition to be acknowledged. That surface reading is accurate as far as it goes, but the surface is not where the interesting material lives. What makes the Cartman and Kenny relationship genuinely strange, stranger than any other pairing in the show's main cast, is what happened to their body. Not metaphorically, literally. The physical substance of each of them has, at multiple points across the show's run, ended up inside the other. Kenny's eyes were transplanted into Cartman's skull. Kenny's ashes were consumed by Cartman, who believed he was drinking chocolate milk. Kenny's soul took up residence inside Cartman's body for the better part of a full season, sharing the space present in Cartman's thoughts and reactions in ways that were occasionally visible to the audience. These are not small narrative details. They are among the strangest things the show has ever done with any two characters, and taken together they constitute a physical entanglement between Cartman and Kenny that has no equivalent anywhere else in the series. The theory this section is concerned with uses that physical entanglement as its foundation. It proposes that Cartman's repeated, anomalous awareness of Kenny's deaths and immortality, his occasional acknowledgement that Kenny dies all the time while everyone else forgets, is not a continuity error or a breaking of the fourth wall for comic effect. It is a consequence of what physically passed between them. The eye, the ashes, the soul. Each of these transfers, the theory argues, left something behind, a residue, a connection, a channel between Cartman's consciousness and Kenny's experience that the usual forgetting mechanism cannot fully close. Start with the eye. The episode Succubus from season 3 contains a detail so strange that it is easy to watch past it without registering what it actually involved. Cartman, experiencing vision problems, goes to an optometrist. Kenny has died in this episode, as he does in most episodes of this era, his body is available. Cartman, in what the show presents as a throwaway joke about his casual relationship with other people's body parts, has Kenny's eyes removed from his corpse and transplanted into his own head. He then spends the rest of the episode seeing through Kenny's eyes. Literally, the lenses through which Cartman perceives the world from this episode forward are Kenny's lenses. Whatever Kenny's eyes were capable of seeing, whatever perceptual relationship Kenny had with the world around him, Cartman has absorbed. The show does not make a big deal of this. It is presented quickly and played for a joke about Cartman's self-centeredness and his complete indifference to Kenny's bodily integrity. But the theory asks what it would actually mean to see through the eyes of someone whose relationship with death and time and memory is as unusual as Kenny's. If Kenny's body carries something of his condition, some physical trace of the immortality and the awareness and the accumulated experience, then transplanting his eyes into Cartman's skull is not a neutral act. It is a transfer of something that goes beyond corneas and retinas. It is giving Cartman a window into a perceptual world that nobody else in South Park has access to. This might explain why Cartman, in the episode Cartmanland, protests Kenny's wrongful death lawsuit by saying Kenny dies all the time, with a specificity and a casualness that implies genuine knowledge rather than a guess. He is not performing awareness. He is not breaking the fourth wall for a quick laugh. He knows because something in him, something installed via the eye transplant, retained what the normal forgetting mechanism erased in everyone else. The eyes remember even when the mind does not. The second physical transfer is more visceral and more disturbing. In the season 6 episode A Ladder to Heaven, Cartman mistakes Kenny's ashes for chocolate milk powder and drinks them. The full contents of an urn containing the cremated remains of a child are consumed by Cartman, who does not realize what he is doing until it is too late and does not seem particularly troubled by it when he finds out. The comedy of the moment is characteristic South Park, playing the horror of the act against Cartman's complete emotional blankness about it. But the consequence of this consumption is not played as a joke. It is played as a genuine supernatural event. Kenny's soul, freed from whatever intermediate state it occupied after the muscular dystrophy death, enters Cartman through the ashes. It takes up residence inside him. For several episodes across season 6, Kenny is present inside Cartman's body, influencing his behavior, occasionally surfacing in his speech and mannerisms in ways that the other characters notice but cannot fully explain. The possession is not complete. Cartman retains his own personality and his own will, but Kenny is in there, sharing the space, existing in the same physical vessel as the person who has always been most casually cruel about his deaths and most dismissive of his suffering. What the soul's presence inside Cartman produces is one of the stranger stretches of storytelling the show attempted in its middle seasons. Cartman begins doing things that are uncharacteristic of him, things that reflect Kenny's impulses rather than his own. The soul is not dominant, but it is not passive either. It is influencing from inside, nudging the behavior of its host in directions that Kenny's own values would have taken it. And Cartman, who is not introspective enough to notice the influence, simply experiences these shifts as his own thoughts and impulses without recognizing that something else is contributing to them. The soul is eventually exercised. It passes through a series of increasingly absurd vessels before finally reaching a pot roast that is consumed by Rob Schneider, who then dies, releasing Kenny back into whatever state preceded his eventual return at the end of the season. The mechanics are ridiculous and deliberately so. But what the season-long possession established in terms of the Cartman and Kenny relationship is not ridiculous at all. It established that these two characters had shared the most intimate possible physical space, that Kenny's consciousness had been inside Cartman's body, that whatever Kenny carried, whatever the accumulated experience of dying and returning and dying again had deposited in his soul, had been present inside Cartman for months. The theory proposes that this left a mark, that you cannot share a body with a consciousness as unusual as Kenny's, a consciousness saturated with the memory of repeated death and rebirth, without some of that saturation transferring. That Cartman emerged from the possession with something installed in him that was not there before. Not Kenny's memories exactly, not the full archive of every death and every awakening, but a sensitivity to Kenny's condition, an awareness, dim and inconsistent but real, that Kenny's relationship with death is different from everyone else's, a residue of the possession that survived the exorcism and has been present in Cartman ever since, surfacing occasionally in moments where he says something about Kenny's deaths that he should not be able to know. This would explain the Cartmanland moment. It would explain the best friends forever dynamic, where Cartman campaigns for Kenny's death with an understanding of what death means for Kenny that goes beyond what anyone else in the episode demonstrates. Everyone else treats Kenny's death as a medical and ethical question. Cartman treats it as something he has a specific and personal relationship with, as though he knows from the the inside what Kenny's death involves in a way that the other characters cannot access. The pity and the will the PlayStation Portable left to Cartman because Kenny felt sorry for him suggests that whatever passed between them during the possession created something mutual. Kenny felt something for Cartman that went beyond their surface dynamic of exploitation and dismissal. And Cartman, though he would never articulate it in any way that resembled genuine feeling, retained something from Kenny that persisted long after the soul had moved on. The deepest version of this theory, the one that extends furthest beyond what the show explicitly supports, proposes that the eye transplant and the ash consumption and the soul possession together created a bond between Cartman and Kenny that is unique in the show's cosmology. Not a friendship exactly, because their relationship has never looked like friendship in any conventional sense, but something, a tether, connection forged through the exchange of physical substance and spiritual presence that makes Cartman, of all people, the character most genuinely linked to Kenny's experience, the most aware, the least able to fully forget, which is its own kind of disturbing conclusion. The person most connected to Kenny's suffering is the person least equipped to respond to it with anything resembling compassion. Cartman knows, in some residual and imprecise way, what Kenny goes through, and he uses that knowledge, when he uses it at all, to manipulate the situation to his own advantage. The awareness that the theory grants him is not an awareness he acts on with kindness. It is an awareness he carries around without fully understanding it, occasionally surfaces without fully intending to, and has never once converted into anything that helped Kenny in any meaningful way. Kenny gave Cartman his eye. Kenny's soul lived in Cartman's body. Kenny left him a PlayStation Portable out of pity. And Cartman, who knows more about what Kenny experiences than anyone else alive, has never once remembered Kenny's death with the weight it deserved. That is the Cartman and Kenny relationship. Physical, strange, asymmetric, and ultimately another version of the same pattern that runs through every aspect of Kenny's existence. He gives, the world takes. Nobody quite sees what the giving cost him. And Kenny, who sees all of it clearly, goes back to the bus stop anyway. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Section 9 traced the strange entanglement between Cartman and Kenny and what it might explain about the one character who occasionally knows more than he should. Section 10 brings everything together around the final question the show has spent nearly 30 years circling without fully answering. Section 10, the future, the sacrifice, and why Kenny always comes back. There is a question underneath everything this essay has covered. Underneath the deaths and the rebirths and the cult meeting and the eye transplants and the purgatory theory and the frozen town and the mother who wakes screaming in the night. It is the question the show has been circling since season 1 without ever landing on directly. The question that every piece of Kenny's lore points toward without quite reaching. Question is not why Kenny died. The show answered that incompletely but sufficiently with the Cthulhu cult and the immortality mechanics and the rebirth cycle. The question is why Kenny keeps coming back, not mechanically, not in terms of what his mother's body does in the night or what cosmic residue his parents' cult attendants left in their family's blood, but in terms of choice, in terms of what Kenny, who is aware of his condition and has been aware of it for as long as he can remember, decides to do with the life he keeps being given back, because Kenny does decide. That is the thing the show establishes quietly and consistently across its entire run, and that the post-COVID specials finally made explicit. Kenny is not passive in his own story. He is not simply a body that dies and is reconstituted and sent back into the world without agency or intention. He is a person who wakes up every morning knowing what his life contains, knowing what is likely to happen to him, knowing that the people around him will not remember it when it does, and choosing to go back anyway, choosing to put the parka on, choosing to walk to the bus stop, choosing to stand next to the friends who cannot hold his experience, and spend another day in a world that has decided his suffering does not require a response. That choice, made quietly and without ceremony and without anyone recognizing it as a choice, is the most important thing Kenny McCormick does. It is more important than any individual death, more important than the sacrifice in the 1999 film, though that sacrifice mattered, more important than commanding heaven's armies in Best Friends Forever, though that moment is remarkable. The daily choice to return, to participate, to remain present in a world that keeps killing him and forgetting it did is the act that defines him. And it is an act that the show, across nearly 30 years, depicted without ever quite naming it as the heroic thing it is. The post-COVID specials, released in 2021, are the closest the show has come to naming it. The future Kenny of those specials, the Nobel laureate and scientist and philanthropist who built a life of extraordinary purpose from the wreckage of the childhood the show spent 24 seasons depicting, is the clearest picture the show has ever offered of what Kenny was always moving toward. Not the deaths, not the gag, not the orange orange parka and the muffled voice and the weekly dispatch and returned toward this, a man who used everything his strange and painful and isolated experience gave him to try to make the world better for the people he loved. The specifics of what adult Kenny was doing in the post-COVID specials are worth sitting with carefully because they reveal something about the continuity of his character across the show's entire history that is easy to miss if you are focused on the plot mechanics. Kenny, in the future, had become a scientist focused on understanding the origins of a pandemic that had damaged his world and fractured his friendships. He was using his intellect and his resources, things he had built from nothing, from a childhood of poverty and muffled speech and weekly death and a family that could barely hold itself together, to try to solve a problem that was larger than himself. He was working alone on something that would help everyone around him. He had built a time travel apparatus. He had been trying to go back, and what he was trying to go back for was not, as it first appeared, primarily about the pandemic itself. The message he left behind, recorded for the friends he knew would eventually find it, revealed that his real motivation was the friendships. The broship, as the specials call it, that had fallen apart during the pandemic years and had left the four boys estranged from each other for decades. Kenny believed that the fracturing of those friendships was the root cause of the bad future he was trying to prevent. He believed that Stan and Kyle and Cartman being separated, being unable to maintain the connection that had defined their childhoods, had consequences that rippled outward far beyond the personal. That a world in which those friendships survived was a meaningfully better world than the one they were all living in. He died trying to restore something he valued more than his own survival. He contracted a new variant during his time travel attempt and brought it back to the present and died from it, and the death undid the work he had been doing, and the world continued in its damaged state until Stan and Kyle and eventually Cartman decided to finish what he started. Kenny's final death in the show's current canon is, like his death in the 1999 film, a sacrifice made for the people around him. He gave up his life, his continued existence, his carefully built future as a scientist and a Nobel laureate and a person who had finally escaped the poverty and the anonymity and the invisibility of his childhood, because he thought the friendship was worth more than all of it. The parallel between the film death and the post-COVID death is too precise to be accidental. In 1999, Kenny wished for everything to go back to the way it was, knowing that doing so would keep him in hell, because the alternative was a world damaged by war and loss. In 2021, Kenny built a time machine and tried to go back to prevent a future damaged by separation and estrangement, and died in the attempt. Both deaths are chosen. Both are made with full knowledge of the cost. Both are made for the benefit of people who, in the moment of the sacrifice, do not fully understand what is being given up for them. The continuity of that pattern, across 22 years of storytelling, is the clearest evidence the show has produced that Kenny was always, underneath the gag and the prop and the weekly dispatch, a character defined by the willingness to give himself up for others. The most disturbing theory this essay can offer, the one that the show's accumulated material makes available without ever stating, is that Kenny's immortality is not a gift and not a curse, but a mirror that reflects back with perfect clarity the question of what a person does when they have nothing to lose, when death is not a threat but a temporary inconvenience, when the worst thing that can happen to you has already happened dozens of times, and you woke up from it and put the parka on and went outside. What do you do with that freedom? What do you choose? What does the absence of mortality's ultimate stakes reveal about what you actually value? Kenny's answer across every death and every return has been consistent. He values the people around him. He values the friendship. He values the connection enough to keep returning to a world that will not remember losing him, to stand next to people who cannot hold his experience, to participate in a community that has decided his suffering is not worth marking, not because he has no other option. He could, in theory, withdraw. He could stop going back to the bus stop. He could decide that a world which forgets him every time he dies does not deserve his continued presence. That choice, the choice to withdraw, would be comprehensible. It would be understandable. It might even be the rational response to his situation. He does not make it. He never makes it. Every morning the parka goes on. Every morning the bus stop. Every morning the same friends who will not remember what happened yesterday, who will not ask where he has been, or what it was like, or whether he is alright. And Kenny, who knows all of this, who has known all of it for as long as he can remember, shows up anyway. The show spent nearly 30 years killing a child in an orange parka and treating those deaths as the punchline of a joke that the audience eventually learned to anticipate. And somewhere inside that joke, growing slowly and accumulating weight with each season, was something that was not a joke at all. It was a portrait of a specific kind of endurance, the kind that does not get recognized because it does not announce itself, the kind that looks from the outside like nothing much, like a boy standing at a bus stop, like a familiar figure in an orange coat, like like something so ordinary and so constant that the world around it has simply stopped seeing it. Kenny McCormick died over 100 times. He came back every single time. Nobody remembered. He remembered everything. And he kept coming back not because the cycle forced him to, not because the mechanics of his immortality left him no alternative, but because the people at the bus stop were worth coming back for, even when they forgot him, especially when they forgot him. That is the most disturbing theory of all. Not the Cthulhu cult, not the purgatory, not the frozen town, or the screaming mother, or the eyes transplanted into Cartman's skull. The most disturbing theory is the simplest one, the one hiding in plain sight underneath every other theory, underneath every death and every return, and every muffled line of dialogue, and every casual "oh my god, they killed Kenny" delivered without weight or grief or recognition. The most disturbing theory is that Kenny knew exactly what his life was, and he chose it anyway, over and over and over again, because the alternative was to stop showing up for the people he loved, and that for Kenny McCormick was never an option. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.